In this video, we will filter based on a user's identity, but using passive authentication this time. In the other video, which was focused on active authentication, the user had to manually authenticate through a web portal before gaining access to the network or out to the internet. This means that the user probably logged on to their computer, then they needed to log on again through the web portal. So if you haven't seen the other video that's focused on active authentication, check that out first before continuing with this video. It's very important. So with passive authentication, that's different. And that is based on how you log on initially to your computer that is added to the Active Directory domain. It will use that information transparently behind the scenes for determining what you are allowed to access. Basically, the user does not need to do any extra step and to log on through the web portal. Now keep in mind that this works for environments where all systems are added into an Active Directory domain with Windows computers. It won't work nicely for systems that are using Mac or Linux-based systems to even contractors or mobile devices. So cases like that will work better with active authentication and redirecting them to a web authenticated portal instead. So just keep those considerations in mind. So for passive authentication, Fortinet calls it differently. They call it the Fortinet Single Sign-On, also called FSSO. And that is what we will set up instead of active authentication in this video. Now, in order to set up FSSO, it requires to have the FSSO agent program installed on an Active Directory server that is connected to the domain and is able to access the users and groups on the domain. This FSSO agent can be found on the Fortinet support site that we showed you when we upgraded the firmware on our firewall to 5.2. So check out that video as we showed you where you can download that file. So in our case, we have downloaded that agent file for FSSO, and then we have uploaded that agent file to the Active Directory domain controller, and that's located here under our, I believe, our downloads folder. Okay, and this here is the file that we need to install on our Windows 2008 server. Let's go ahead and do that now. Okay, and we'll say run, and that will start the Windows installer. Let's go ahead and clean up this by minimizing this window here. Okay, so here we'll begin the collector agent install. Now this is really a two-step process. So here we're going to say next. We will accept the user agreement. Next is the default destination folder, which you typically leave alone anyway. So we're going to say next to continue. And here we need to specify the account that will be used for starting the FSSO service. So we will use our admin account that exists in our domain, which is RouteHub. And enter our correct password. Okay, we'll say next. So on this page, for the install options, we will use the default settings, which is important for the FortiGate to monitor the logon events by our connected users to determine their username and the group that they are associated to. So let's go ahead and say next. And finally, let's install the collector part of the agent. When that completes, we want to launch the DC Agent Install Wizard, which is checked here by default. So we'll say finish. Here, we must enter the IP address of the Active Directory server that has the FSSO agent installed and acting as our collector. Well, in our case, that will be this server that we are on. So it's important to make sure that the correct IP address is listed, and in our case, that is the correct IP of our domain controller. So we're going to go ahead and click on next. Here, we will select the domains that we want our FSSO agent to monitor, and that will be our Route Hub domain. On this page, we have the option of selecting which user accounts we don't want to monitor for logon events, but we will monitor all logon events for all users in our domain. For the working mode, we will select DC Agent mode, which will install the DC Agent on this server. And we'll say yes to this message. Okay, and now it is successfully installed and a reboot of our domain controller is required. When our Active Directory domain controller returns after the reboot, let's launch the FSSO agent config, which can be found right here. And here we will see most of the details that we selected or not selected during the DC Agent install wizard. So for example, you will see that monitoring logon user events is checked. You also see that the agent is running on our domain controller. Under authentication, we will require a authenticated connection from our FortiGate firewall. So we will specify the password that must match on our FortiGate when we set up FSSO there. And once we're done, we will go ahead and apply the changes. And when that completes, we will save and close.